Hello class, this is your lecture on water relations in plants. Let's get started. The outline is as follows. First we'll talk about molecular movement, which is to say what is a comparison of diffusion versus osmosis and why is it important to plant cells. Then we'll talk about the ways in which water moves through plants, which will involve a discussion of cohesion tension theory, regulation of transpiration, transport of organic solutes, and finally the pressure flow hypothesis. Then we'll end the lecture with a few words on the mineral requirements for growth. First, a review. Let's talk about diffusion versus osmosis in general. Diffusion is a passive type of transport. It's simply a spreading out of particles over time on their own with no extra energy required. As a case in point, think about if we drop a tablet of some color-containing substance into a beaker of water. Over time, that pigment will dissolve into the water and eventually the water will be, for example, purple. Diffusion happens over a concentration gradient. That is to say, molecules spread out on their own over time, and they move from high concentration to low concentration until eventually there's no concentration gradient when, for example, that blue dye or purple dye is completely diffused throughout that beaker of water. In summary, passive transport means that molecules move from high to low concentration. No extra energy is required, and it may or may not use protein channels in those cell membranes. For example, if the polarity or size of the molecule in question works through the membrane itself, then it might not need to use the protein channel. Think about water. H2O is so tiny, so it can fit through many different types of barriers. Osmosis is a passive transport of water molecules specifically across the membrane. And there are three ways that we need to describe the movement of water. We've got hypertonic, isotonic, and hypotonic. And both of these refer to the environment in which we place our cell. If we place our cell into a hypotonic environment, the cell will gain water from the surrounding environment. Hypo means below, and in this case, it's below the concentration in the cell. If we place our cell into a hypertonic environment, the cell loses water to the surrounding environment. Hyper means above. In this case, it's above the concentration in the cell, so water leaves the cell. In an isotonic environment, there's no net change in cell volume. Iso means same as, so we have water moving into and out of our cell. Now, plants treat these different types of tonic states a little bit differently than animals. Water balance in plant cells is different, and it has to do with metabolism and the need for plants to have this water for photosynthesis. Now, underwatered plants tend to wilt, right? If you forget to water your houseplant, after a couple weeks, those leaves will start to droop, and that's because of a drop in turgor pressure. Now, plant cells are turgid, which is to say happiest or normal when they're placed in a hypotonic solution, because then lots of water will rush into those vacuoles. But the cell won't burst because it is protected by that rigid cell wall. Remember, animal cells don't have a rigid cell wall. Now, in an isotonic solution, plants will actually start to droop a little bit. We say that the cells become flaccid. And in a hypertonic solution, plant cells undergo plasmolysis, which is really bad. Then the water leaves the vacuole completely and the internal structure shrivels up. Now the cell itself doesn't shrivel up because, again, it's surrounded by a rigid cell wall. In addition to passive transport, cells, including plant cells, often need to do active transport as well. And active transport is the pumping of molecules across the membrane with ATP as the energy source. This allows plants to move solutes against the concentration gradient. So now we can go from low to high concentration, but that means we must use extra energy. Active transport, therefore, in summary, means we're moving from low to high concentration, and because we're going against the concentration gradient, we must use extra energy. We also must use protein pumps because that energy has to interact with that protein in order to move these solutes up the gradient. This diagram shows us a nice comparison of passive versus active transport. And notice that there's really two types of passive transport, which is to say we're moving down a concentration gradient. In simple diffusion, we're moving directly through the cell membrane, but in facilitated diffusion, we're moving through a membrane protein. However, for facilitated diffusion, no energy is required because we're moving down the gradient. So in plants, osmosis is essential because we have to have water in these vacuoles in order for plant cells to maintain their cellular health. Where does the water come from? Well, most of it is absorbed from the roots. So the pathway of water through a plant typically enters from soil into cell walls and also into intercellular spaces of both root hairs and other cells in the roots. As the water crosses a differentially permeable membrane and cytoplasm of the endodermis, it eventually flows into the xylem. Once it gets in the xylem, it moves up through the stems to the leaves and eventually, through the process of transpiration, evaporates out into the atmosphere. Now, when plants lose their water through osmosis, we call this plasmolysis. And plasmolyzed cells are not happy cells because the protoplasm shrinks away from the cell wall. Another term that's related to molecular movement in plant cells is imbibition. This refers to the fact that large molecules, such as cellulose and starch, develop electrical charges when wet, and thus attract water molecules to them. Water molecules adhere to large molecules, which results in the swelling of tissues. For example, beans are types of seeds, and these seeds swell up and fill up with water before they germinate. We say that the seeds imbibe water. So therefore, imbibition is the first step in the germination of most seeds. Water moves through plants through those special tubes called xylem, and it's a completely passive process. Transpiration does not require any energy. It's simply going to be movement of water by concentration gradients. Now, 90% or more of the water that comes into a plant actually leaves the plant. It isn't used by metabolic processes. It's transpired out into the atmosphere. However, water is needed for very important functions, including cellular activity, maintaining turgor pressure, and evaporative cooling. So the theory that describes how water moves through plants is called cohesion tension theory. Cohesion means that there is an attraction between charged molecules. We've got relatively weak hydrogen bonds that hold these molecules together. On the other hand, adhesion means water molecules are sticking to the inside of these xylem capillary walls. When water transpires, the cells involved develop a lower water potential than the adjacent cells. This simply creates tension on the water column, drawing water from one molecule to another and throughout the entire span of the xylem, from root to stem to leaf. It's important to note that the water potential of the soil is greater than the water potential in the air. The regulation of transpiration is largely through the stomatal apparatus that involves 2 guard cells plus 1 opening, and that opening is called the stoma. Transpiration rates are influenced by humidity, light, temperature, and carbon dioxide concentration. When photosynthesis occurs, the stomata open up. This process is quite simple. Guard cells expend energy to acquire potassium ions from adjacent epidermal cells. This means active transport needs to happen through protein channels. This active transport and movement of these ions causes lower water potential in the guard cells. Therefore, water passively enters the guard cells by osmosis. The guard cells become turgid and the stomatal apparatus opens. When photosynthesis does not occur, the stomata typically close, and it's basically the opposite of what we just described. Potassium ions leave the guard cells simply through facilitated diffusion through protein channels. If the ions leave, the water follows, and then the guard cells become less turgid and the stomata close. Stomata of most plants are open during the day and closed at night, because during the day is when the sunlight is out, and that is important for the photosynthesis to work. However, there are exceptions. For example, the stomata of many desert plants open only at night. This conserves water but makes carbon dioxide inaccessible during the day. Therefore, these plants must use a special type of photosynthesis called CAM photosynthesis. Now, if the stomata are closed at night, but the soil is particularly moist, the water will actually enter the roots and build up in the xylem, causing lots of pressure. And this is what leads to guttation. The guttation of water means drops of water are seen at the tips of leaves by special openings called hydothodes. One of the most important functions of water in the plant involves the translocation of food substances in solution by the phloem. In fact, most of our knowledge of this subject came from studying aphids feeding on phloem. Aphids pierce the phloem with a sucking needle mouth part. Turgor pressure in the plant forces the photosynthate fluids through the animal's digestive tract and out the rear. This is referred to as quote-unquote honeydew. We can also use radioactive carbon dioxide tracers to see exactly where this sugar moves. And using special equipment, we see that sure enough, this sugar only translocates through the phloem. Photosynthate flows from a source where water enters by osmosis, and this is best described by the pressure flow hypothesis. Sucrose molecules are moved along concentration gradients between sources and sinks. This diagram from our textbook shows us how these sugars move from sources to sinks. In the last part of this lecture, we'll talk about the mineral requirements for growth. First up, the essential elements. These are the building blocks for compounds synthesized by plant metabolism. And carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the most important. These make up most of a plant. Also remember things like glucose and fructose are made up exclusively of these elements. The above three, which is to say carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, plus phosphate, potassium, nitrogen, and sulfur, make up 99% of a plant. Macronutrients are those nutrients that are used in plants in much greater amounts. The macronutrients includes things like nitrogen, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and sulfur. Micronutrients, on the other hand, are needed in tiny amounts. Fractions of a percent are needed for metabolism to work. And macro and micronutrients truly work together. For example, calcium is an essential part of the middle lamella and is involved in moving substances like sodium through cell membranes. Calcium is a macronutrient and sodium is a micronutrient. All right, in review, we've now learned all things diffusion and osmosis, as well as all of the theories that describe how water moves through plants and the mineral requirements for plant growth. Thanks so much for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions.